The fluorescent lights of Walmart hummed their eternal tune on the morning of November 28, 1997. Black Friday had come and gone, leaving behind scattered remnants of America's annual consumer frenzy. Empty shopping carts dotted the parking lot like metallic tombstones, and inside the Millfield, Ohio store, the employees moved through their post-holiday cleanup with the weary efficiency of soldiers after battle. Nobody could have predicted that this particular Walmart would become the epicenter of one of Ohio's most haunting unsolved mysteries. In a case that would span nearly 3 decades, baffle federal investigators, and ultimately reveal something so disturbing that it would shake the very foundations of what people thought they knew about missing persons cases in small-town America. The story begins not with screams or violence, but with silence. The kind of silence that settles over a life when 2 people simply disappear. Rebecca and Thomas Walsh had been married for 6 years when they vanished without a trace. She was 28, an elementary school teacher with gentle eyes and a laugh that could fill an entire classroom. He was 31, a mechanic whose calloused hands could fix anything with an engine, but who treated his wife like she was made of porcelain. They lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on Elm Street, the kind of place where neighbors borrowed sugar and everyone knew everyone else's business. Or so they thought. The Walsh couple had no children, though not by choice. Rebecca had suffered 3 miscarriages in their 6 years together, each loss drawing them closer in their shared grief, while simultaneously isolating them from a world that seemed to assume parenthood was every married couple's destiny. Thomas worked long hours at Miller's auto shop to afford the fertility treatments that never seemed to work. Rebecca threw herself into teaching other people's children, pouring the maternal love she couldn't give to her own into lesson plans and art projects that covered every wall of their small home. Their neighbors described them as quiet, reliable, and deeply devoted to each other. The Hendersons next door would later tell police that the Walshes were the kind of couple you'd want living beside you. They kept their lawn manicured, never played music too loud, and always brought in each other's mail when one of them traveled. Thomas shoveled Mrs. Peterson's driveway every winter without being asked. Rebecca volunteered at the local animal shelter every Saturday morning, coming home with stories about the dogs and cats she'd helped find new homes. They were, by all accounts, ordinary people living an ordinary life in an ordinary town, which made what happened to them all the more extraordinary and terrifying. The last confirmed sighting of Rebecca and Thomas Walsh occurred at 4:47 p.m. on November 27, 1997, Thanksgiving Day. Security footage from the Millfield Walmart showed them entering the store together, Thomas pushing a cart while Rebecca consulted a handwritten shopping list. The grainy black and white video revealed nothing unusual about their demeanor or appearance. Rebecca wore a cream-colored sweater and dark jeans. Thomas had on his favorite Cleveland Browns jacket, the one Rebecca had given him for his birthday that year. They were shopping for Black Friday supplies, according to the receipt later found in Rebecca's purse. Disposable cameras, batteries, a thermos, energy bars, and comfortable walking shoes. The receipt was time-stamped 5:23 p.m., indicating they'd spent roughly 36 minutes in the store, but a perfectly normal shopping trip for a couple preparing to brave the holiday crowds the next morning. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. The parking lot security camera that should have captured them leaving the store had malfunctioned sometime between 5 and 5:30 p.m. that evening. The official maintenance log showed no scheduled repairs, and the camera had been working perfectly all day until that crucial 30-minute window. When it resumed recording at 5:31 p.m., the Walsh's burgundy 1994 Honda Accord was nowhere to be seen. The couple never made it home for Thanksgiving dinner. Rebecca's mother, Dorothy Mills, had been cooking since dawn. Turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce made from scratch, using her own mother's recipe, sweet potato casserole with marshmallows, green bean casserole, and Thomas's favorite apple pie. She'd set the dining room table with her good china, the set she'd inherited from Rebecca's grandmother, complete with cloth napkins and the silver candlesticks that only came out for special occasions. When Rebecca and Thomas failed to arrive by 6:30 p.m., Dorothy called their house. No answer. She tried again at 7 p.m., then 7:30, then 8. By 9 p.m. she was pacing her kitchen, the untouched feast growing cold on the table. Her husband, Frank, suggested they might have had car trouble or decided to stay late at another family gathering, but Dorothy knew better. Rebecca never missed dinner without calling. She was pathologically punctual, a trait that had driven her college roommates crazy but had made her an excellent teacher. "Something's wrong," Dorothy told Frank as she dialed their number for the 12th time that evening. Rebecca would never do this. Frank Mills was a practical man who'd spent 30 years working at the steel mill before it closed down. He didn't believe in hunches or women's intuition, but he believed in his daughter's character. Rebecca might be many things, but thoughtless wasn't one of them. If she said she'd be somewhere at a certain time, she'd be there. Period. Ariad. Went on. By 10 p.m. the Mills were in their car driving to Elm Street. The Walsh house sat dark and empty, their burgundy Accord absent from the driveway. Dorothy used her spare key to let herself in, calling their names as she walked through rooms that felt wrong somehow, though she couldn't put her finger on why. Everything looked normal. Rebecca's purse sat on the kitchen counter next to Thomas's wallet and keys, as if they'd just stepped out for a few minutes and would be right back. But the bed was made with military precision, hospital corners and all. Rebecca never made the bed that neatly unless they were expecting company or going to be away for several days. It was a small detail, but it stuck with Dorothy like a splinter under the skin. The Mills called the Millfield Police Department at 10:47 p.m. Detective Ray Kowalski took the call, a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything small-town Ohio had to offer. Missing persons reports on Thanksgiving night were usually drunk relatives who'd wandered off after family arguments, or young adults who'd decided to spend the holiday with friends instead of parents. He assured the Mills that the Walsh couple would probably turn up by morning with a perfectly reasonable explanation. They didn't. One Black Friday morning arrived gray and bitter cold, with the kind of wind that cuts through even the heaviest coats. Shoppers lined up outside the Walmart before dawn, clutching thermoses of coffee and chatting excitedly about the deals they hoped to score. The Walsh couple should have been among them, armed with their carefully planned strategy and newly purchased supplies. Instead, their absence was noted only by Dorothy Mills, who called the police station every hour starting at 6 a.m. Detective Kowalski officially opened a missing persons investigation at 2 p.m. on November 28th, 45 hours after the couple's last confirmed sighting. By then, the trail had gone cold in the most literal sense. An early winter storm had moved through overnight, covering any potential physical evidence with 3 inches of snow. The initial investigation followed standard protocols. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed family and friends, and checked hospitals within a 50-mile radius. Rebecca's principal at Millfield Elementary, Margaret Foster, confirmed that Rebecca had seemed perfectly normal during their brief conversation on Tuesday, the day before Thanksgiving. She'd been excited about the holiday break and had mentioned plans to use Black Friday shopping as a way to get started on Christmas gifts. Thomas's boss at Miller's auto shop, Pete Miller, said Thomas had worked until 3 p.m. on Wednesday and had seemed his usual self. He'd even joked about having to carry all of Rebecca's shopping bags the next day, a comment that now carried unintended weight. The couple's bank account showed no unusual activity, and their credit cards hadn't been used since the Walmart purchase. The phone records revealed nothing suspicious, just the usual calls to family members, Rebecca's school and Thomas's workplace. Their life insurance policies were modest and had no unusual beneficiaries. Everything pointed to a couple who'd simply vanished into thin air. But Detective Kowalski had learned not to believe in magic during his 2 decades on the force. People didn't just disappear, especially not ordinary people living ordinary lives in ordinary towns. There was always an explanation, even when it took months or years to find it. And the first break in the case came from an unexpected source, a Walmart employee named Jimmy Patterson who'd been working in the electronics department on Thanksgiving Day. Jimmy was 19, saving money for community college while living in his parents' basement. But he had the kind of memory for faces that made him excellent at spotting shoplifters, and he remembered the Walsh couple distinctly. Not because of anything they did, but because of who they were with. They came through my department around 5:15, Jimmy told Detective Kowalski during his interview on December 3rd. Nice couple, bought some batteries and film. But there was this other guy with them, older guy, maybe 50 or so. Tall, thin, wearing a black coat. He didn't buy anything, just kind of watched them. This was the first anyone had heard of a third person being with the Walshes. Jimmy's description was detailed enough to work with. Approximately 6 feet tall, thin build, salt and pepper hair, clean-shaven, wearing a long black wool coat and dark pants. He'd spoken with a slight accent that Jimmy couldn't place, maybe southern or possibly foreign. Did they seem to know each other? Kowalski asked. Jimmy shrugged. Hard to say. The guy seemed familiar with them, but something felt off. Like they weren't exactly comfortable with him being there, you know? The woman kept looking at her husband like she wanted to leave. Security footage from the electronics department confirmed Jimmy's account. The timestamp showed 5:16 p.m. and there, clear as day, stood Rebecca and Thomas Walsh with a tall, thin man in a black coat. The video quality was too poor to make out facial features, but his posture and movement suggested someone comfortable with taking charge of situations. The mystery man stayed with the Walshes for approximately 4 minutes, during which time Rebecca purchased batteries and Thomas bought 2 disposable cameras. The man never approached the counter, remaining several steps behind the couple throughout the transaction. When they left the electronics department, he followed them toward the front of the store. That was the last time anyone saw any of them. Detective Kowalski expanded the investigation to include the mysterious third man. He showed Jimmy's composite sketch to every employee who'd worked that day, but no one else remembered seeing the trio together. The sketch was distributed to local newspapers and posted in businesses throughout Millfield, but no one came forward with information about the man's identity. The investigation began to take on the characteristics that would define it for the next 27 years, tantalizing clues that led nowhere, the witnesses who remembered just enough to be helpful but not enough to be definitive, and a growing sense that something much larger and more sinister than a simple missing persons case was unfolding. Dorothy Mills became the case's most persistent advocate. She called Detective Kowalski every Monday morning for updates, organized search parties every weekend for the first 6 months, and plastered missing person flyers on every telephone pole and bulletin board within 100 miles of Millfield. Her husband Frank took early retirement to help with the search efforts, spending his days driving back roads and checking abandoned buildings. The months stretched into years, and still no trace of Rebecca and Thomas Walsh surfaced. Their house sat empty for 3 years before Dorothy finally accepted that her daughter and son-in-law weren't coming home. She couldn't bear to sell it, so she rented it to a young teacher who reminded her painfully of Rebecca. Every month, when she collected the rent, she'd walk through the rooms hoping to find some clue that had been missed, some sign that would explain what had happened to her daughter. Detective Kowalski retired in 2003 without solving the case, but he never stopped thinking about it. The Walsh disappearance had become his white whale, the one case that haunted his dreams and made him question everything he thought he knew about police work. He kept copies of all the files in his home office and continued investigating on his own time, following up on tips that trickled in from other jurisdictions and cold case units. The case officially went cold in 2005, then transferred to a filing cabinet in the basement of the Millfield Police Department along with dozens of other unsolved mysteries. Few detectives would occasionally pull the files and spend a few weeks re-interviewing witnesses and chasing old leads, but nothing ever came of their efforts. Life moved on, as life has a way of doing even in the face of incomprehensible tragedy. Millfield's population continued its slow decline as young people moved away for opportunities in larger cities. The Walmart where the Walshes were last seen underwent several renovations and management changes, and the employees who'd worked there on that Thanksgiving Day found other jobs or retired. Jimmy Patterson finished community college and became an accountant in Columbus, though he never forgot the couple and the mysterious man in the black coat. Dorothy Mills aged 20 years in the first 5, her hair turning completely gray and her face settling into lines of permanent worry. She developed the habit of scanning crowds wherever she went, searching for faces she'd never forgotten. She kept Rebecca's bedroom exactly as it had been, changing the sheets weekly even though no one slept in them. Frank handled his grief by building things, constructing an elaborate garden shed, a deck, a gazebo, anything that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. The Walsh case became part of Millfield's local folklore, the kind of story parents used to warn their children about talking to strangers and staying close to family. It was whispered about at church socials and discussed in hushed tones at the grocery store. Some people developed theories about what had happened, most involving the mysterious man in the black coat and scenarios too dark to discuss openly. But as the years passed, even the whispers faded. New tragedies replaced old ones in the collective memory. The Walsh disappearance became just another unsolved mystery in a world full of them, filed away in the basement with the other cases that had no answers. Then came November 15, 2024. 27 years, 11 months and 18 days after Rebecca and Thomas Walsh vanished from the Walmart parking lot, a maintenance worker named Carlos Vega was cleaning out the store's lost and found room in preparation for a major renovation. The room had accumulated decades' worth of forgotten items, jackets, purses, toys, electronics, jewelry, and countless other possessions that customers had left behind and never claimed. Carlos had been tasked with sorting everything into 3 categories: items that could be donated to charity, electronics and valuables that needed to be properly disposed of, and obvious trash. It was tedious work that he approached with the methodical patience of someone who'd spent 15 years working retail. He was 3 hours into the job when he found the box. It was an ordinary cardboard shipping box about the size of a shoebox, taped shut and wedged behind a metal shelf that hadn't been moved in years. There was no label or marking to indicate what it contained or when it had been placed there. The cardboard was yellowed with age and felt slightly soft, the way paper gets when it's been exposed to humidity for years. Carlos almost threw it directly into the trash pile, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the weight of it, heavier than he'd expected for its size. Maybe it was the way it had been hidden behind the shelf, as if someone had deliberately concealed it. Or maybe it was just the instinct that comes from handling thousands of lost items over the years, the ability to sense when something doesn't belong. He cut through the tape with his utility knife and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, were 2 items that would reignite the Walsh investigation and send shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across Ohio. The first was a disposable camera, the kind that had been popular in the 1990s before digital photography took over. The camera was a Kodak fun-saver, exactly the type Thomas Walsh had purchased on November 27, 1997. It had been used, all 27 exposures taken, but never developed. The second item was a woman's driver's license in a clear plastic sleeve. The license belonged to Rebecca Lynn Walsh, expired November 28, 2002. Her photo smiled up from the plastic, frozen in time at age 28. Carlos stared at the items for a long moment, his mind trying to process what he was looking at. He'd worked at the Millfield Walmart for 15 years, long enough to have heard the stories about the couple who'd disappeared on Black Friday 1997. Everyone who'd worked there for more than a few years knew about the Walsh case, the way people know about local ghost stories or urban legends. But holding Rebecca Walsh's driver's license in his hands made the story real in a way that hearing about it never had. Carlos carefully replaced the items in the box and carried it to the manager's office. Store manager Patricia Hoffman listened to his explanation with growing amazement, then immediately called the Millfield Police Department. Within an hour, the box and its contents were in the hands of Detective Lisa Morse, the current lead on cold cases. Detective Morse had read the Walsh file cover to cover when she'd inherited the case 3 years earlier, but like her predecessors, she'd found no new leads to pursue. The discovery of the camera and driver's license represented the first significant break in the case in over a quarter century. The disposable camera was sent to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation for development and analysis. The technology had improved dramatically since 1997, And forensic experts were optimistic that they could recover images, even from film that had been stored improperly for decades. What they found when they developed the film would change everything investigators thought they knew about the Walsh disappearance. The 27 photographs told a story that no one had expected, a story that was both more complex and more disturbing than anyone had imagined. They showed Rebecca and Thomas Walsh, but not as the happy couple browsing Walmart aisles. Instead, the images documented what appeared to be the final hours of their lives, captured by someone who wanted to preserve every moment of whatever had happened to them. The first few photographs were innocuous enough, Rebecca and Thomas in what appeared to be a basement or underground room, sitting on folding chairs and looking confused but not frightened. The lighting was artificial, probably from fluorescent bulbs, and the walls were concrete block painted white. There were no windows visible in any of the shots. As the sequence progressed, the couple's expressions changed from confusion to fear to something approaching terror. By photograph 15, Rebecca was clearly crying, though the poor image quality made it impossible to determine if she was injured or simply frightened. Thomas appeared to be trying to comfort her while simultaneously watching something or someone outside the camera's frame. The final photographs were the most disturbing. They showed the couple separated, each tied to what appeared to be a different chair in what might have been the same room or a different location entirely. The lighting was different, harsher, creating stark shadows that obscured important details. In the last photograph, number 27, both Rebecca and Thomas were looking directly at the camera with expressions that forensic psychologist Dr. Amanda Foster would later describe as resigned terror. The look of people who had moved beyond hope of rescue and were simply trying to maintain their dignity in the face of whatever was happening to them. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the photographs was what they didn't show, any clear view of their captor or captors. Whoever had taken the pictures had been careful to remain out of frame, though shadows and reflections suggested the presence of at least one other person, possibly more. The film itself underwent extensive forensic analysis. Experts determined that it had indeed been stored in less than ideal conditions for approximately 27 years, consistent with being placed in the Walmart lost and found sometime shortly after the couple's disappearance. The camera matched the serial number of one of the two disposable cameras Thomas Walsh had purchased on November 27, 1997. More disturbing still was the timeline suggested by the photographs. Based on the lighting conditions and the couple's appearance, forensic experts estimated that the images had been taken over a period of several hours, possibly an entire day. The sequence suggested that Rebecca and Thomas had been held captive for an extended period before the photographs ended without showing their ultimate fate. Detective Morse found herself staring at the developed pictures late into the night, trying to extract every possible detail from the grainy images. The concrete block walls suggested a basement or underground location. The folding chairs appeared to be generic metal ones that could be purchased at any number of stores. The lighting fixtures were standard fluorescent shop lights, again readily available and providing no unique identifying characteristics. But there were small details that might prove significant. In photograph 8, a portion of what appeared to be a calendar was visible on the wall behind Rebecca, though the image quality made it impossible to determine the year or month. In photograph 19, something that might have been a tool or piece of equipment was partially visible in the background, though again the resolution was too poor for positive identification. The discovery of the camera and photographs prompted a complete reopening of the Walsh case. A joint task force was formed including the Millfield Police Department, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and the FBI's Cold Case Unit. Federal involvement was justified by the possibility that the crime had crossed state lines and by the sophisticated nature of the apparent kidnapping and documentation. The task force's first priority was determining how the box had ended up in the Walmart lost and found. Store records from 1997 were incomplete, and the employee turnover rate meant that very few people who'd worked there during the relevant time period were still available for questioning. Of those who could be located, none remembered seeing the box or had any knowledge of how it might have been placed behind the shelf. Security footage from 1997 had long since been destroyed or recycled, standard practice for retail establishments at the time. The investigation would have to rely on physical evidence, witness testimony, and the photographs themselves to piece together what had happened to Rebecca and Thomas Walsh. As word of the discovery spread through Millfield, the case once again became the subject of intense local interest. Dorothy Mills, now 79 and suffering from early-stage dementia, was told about the photographs by her son Michael, who'd moved back to town to care for her. Her reaction was heartbreaking in its mixture of hope and despair. "Does this mean we might finally know what happened to her?" she asked, her voice trembling with an emotion that encompassed 27 years of unanswered questions. The honest answer was that no one knew. The photographs raised as many questions as they answered, and some of those questions were more disturbing than anything investigators had previously considered. Who had taken the photographs and why? What had happened to Rebecca and Thomas after the final image was captured? How had the camera ended up in the Walmart lost and found, and when? Most chilling of all, was the person or persons responsible for the couple's disappearance still alive, still free, possibly still active? The investigation was just beginning, but already it was clear that the Walsh case was far more complex than anyone had imagined. The discovery of the photographs suggested a level of premeditation and psychological sophistication that transformed the case from a possible random crime to something much more calculated and sinister. As the task force began their work in earnest, one thing became increasingly clear after 27 years of silence. The Walsh case was about to reveal secrets that would shock everyone involved in the investigation, secrets that some people had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep buried. The answers they sought were out there, waiting in the shadows of a decades-old crime that had never truly been solved, only forgotten. But now, with the photographs as evidence and modern investigative techniques at their disposal, the truth about what had happened to Rebecca and Thomas Walsh on that cold November day in 1997 might finally be within reach. The question that haunted everyone involved was whether they were prepared for what they might find. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit received the Walsh case files on a Tuesday morning in December 2024. Special Agent Victoria Hayes had seen hundreds of cold cases cross her desk over the past 15 years. But something about the photographs from the disposable camera made her pause her morning coffee and study each image with the kind of intensity usually reserved for active serial killer investigations. The methodical documentation bothered her more than the obvious signs of captivity, and whoever had taken these photographs wasn't acting on impulse or rage. This was someone who understood the psychological impact of creating a permanent record, someone who wanted to preserve not just the event, but the victim's emotional deterioration. And the progression from confusion to terror was too carefully orchestrated to be coincidental. This wasn't their first time, Agent Hayes told the task force during their first joint meeting on December 10, 2024. The positioning, the lighting, the systematic documentation. This suggests someone with experience, possibly someone who had done this before. The implications sent a chill through the room. If the Walsh case wasn't an isolated incident, they might be looking at a serial predator who had been operating undetected for decades. Agent Hayes recommended expanding the investigation to include missing persons cases from surrounding states during the 1990s, thus looking specifically for couples or pairs who had vanished under similar circumstances. The task force also began working with database specialists to enhance the photographs using modern digital restoration techniques, hoping to extract details that weren't visible to the naked eye. Meanwhile, Detective Morse had begun the painstaking process of re-interviewing everyone connected to the original case. Most of the witnesses were now in their 60s or 70s, as their memories faded by time and complicated by years of local speculation about what had happened to the young couple. Jimmy Patterson, the former Walmart employee who had provided the description of the mystery man in the black coat, but was now 46 and working as a senior accountant for a Columbus firm. When Detective Morse contacted him about the discovery of the photographs, his reaction was immediate and visceral. "I knew something was wrong that day," he told her during their phone conversation. "I have thought about that couple probably once a week for the past 27 years. There was something about that man with them, the way he carried himself. Like he owned the situation, you know? Like everything was going exactly according to his plan. Jimmy agreed to work with a police sketch artist to update his description of the mystery man, lately incorporating details that might have surfaced in his memory over the intervening years. The new composite showed a gaunt face with sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and thin lips curved in what might have been a slight smile. It was the face of someone comfortable with control, someone who enjoyed having power over others. The updated sketch was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the Midwest, along with a request for information about similar disappearances involving couples. The response was overwhelming and disturbing. Within a week, the task force had received reports of 17 similar cases dating back to 1985. Couples who had vanished from public places, often retail establishments, often during busy holiday periods when security attention was divided among crowd control and loss prevention. The geographic spread covered 8 states, suggesting either multiple perpetrators working independently or a single individual with exceptional mobility and organizational skills. Agent Hayes flew to Ohio to personally review the pattern emerging from the data. What she found exceeded her worst expectations. The cases shared too many similarities to be coincidental. In every instance, the missing couples were in their 20s or early 30s, married but childless, with stable employment, and no history of domestic violence or substance abuse. They had vanished during peak shopping periods when stores were crowded and security resources stretched thin. In each case, witnesses reported seeing the couples with an unidentified third party shortly before their disappearance. Most disturbing of all, none of the other missing couples had ever been found. No bodies, no ransom demands, no contact with family members. They had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind grieving relatives and cold case files that had never been connected until now. We are looking at a predator who has been operating for at least 40 years, Agent Hayes informed FBI Director Patricia Wilson during a secure video conference on December 18th. Based on the pattern analysis, we estimate he may be responsible for the disappearance of at least 20 couples, possibly more. The revelation that the Walsh case might be connected to a decades-long serial predator prompted the formation of a federal task force designated Operation Lost Friday. The name reflected both the holiday shopping connection and the sense that these couples had been lost not just to their families, but to a justice system that had failed to recognize the pattern. As the investigation expanded, advances in digital photography enhancement began yielding results from the Walsh photographs. Computer analysis revealed previously invisible details in the background of several images. In photograph 12, enhancement revealed part of a shipping label on a cardboard box, though the text remained too blurred to read completely. In photograph 21, the reflection in what appeared to be a metal surface showed a partial view of someone's arm, clothed in what looked like a dark sweater or jacket. But the most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the concrete block walls visible in the photographs. Dr. Martin Foster, a forensic archaeologist consulted by the task force, noticed distinctive characteristics in the way the blocks were laid and finished. The mortar joints showed a particular pattern that suggested the work had been done by someone with professional masonry experience, but the overall construction quality was inconsistent with standard building practices. "This looks like retrofit work," Dr. Foster explained to the task force. "Someone took an existing space, probably a basement or underground area, and modified it for a specific purpose. The block work is functional but not cosmetic. Whoever did this wasn't concerned with appearance, just with creating a secure, contained environment." The analysis suggested that the photographs had been taken in a purpose-built holding facility, a space specifically designed and constructed for keeping captives. The implications were staggering. They weren't just looking for someone who had committed crimes of opportunity, but someone who had invested significant time, money, and effort into creating the infrastructure for repeated kidnappings. The task force began focusing on individuals with construction experience who had owned or had access to properties with suitable basement or underground spaces during the relevant time periods. Through cross-referencing construction licenses, property records, leases, and do-nen-do-I. Missing persons reports from 1985 through 1997 generated a list of over 300 potential suspects across the 8 affected states. While federal agents worked through the suspect list, Detective Morse continued investigating the local aspects of the Walsh case. The question of how the camera had ended up in the Walmart lost and found remained unanswered, and she suspected that detail might be the key to identifying their perpetrator. Store manager Patricia Hoffman had worked at the Millfield Walmart for 12 years, arriving 6 years after the Walsh disappearance. But she put Detective Morse in touch with Helen Kowalski, the previous manager who had been in charge during the 1990s. Helen was now 73 and living in a retirement community in Florida, but her memory of the Walsh case remained sharp. "I remember that couple," Helen told Detective Morse during their phone conversation. "Such a tragedy. Everyone who worked here talked about it for months afterward. We all kept expecting them to walk through the door like it had all been some terrible misunderstanding." Helen confirmed that the lost and found procedure in 1997 would have required any items turned in to be logged in a record book with the date, description, and name of the employee who received them. She also remembered that the lost and found room had been reorganized several times over the years, with older items being moved to make room for new ones. If someone had wanted to hide something in that room, they could have done it, Helen admitted. Especially during the holiday season when we were so busy, that people were coming and going constantly, employees, vendors, delivery drivers. Security wasn't what it is today. The possibility that their perpetrator had deliberately placed the camera in the lost and found introduced a new dimension to the case. It suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the store's operations, possibly an employee or someone who had conducted regular business there. It also implied that the photographs were meant to be discovered eventually, a delayed revelation designed to maximize psychological impact. Agent Hayes began developing a psychological profile of their suspect based on the accumulated evidence. The perpetrator was likely a white male between 50 and 70 years old in 2024, but making him between 23 and 43 during the earliest known disappearances. He had construction or contracting experience and access to suitable properties for creating hidden detention facilities. He was highly organized, patient, and psychologically sophisticated enough to understand the long-term impact of his actions. Most chilling of all, he appeared to derive satisfaction not just from the crimes themselves, but from the ongoing suffering of the victims' families. The deliberate placement of the camera where it would eventually be found suggested someone who wanted the families to know their loved ones had suffered, even if they never learned the ultimate fate of the missing couples. The psychological profile was distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide, along with a request for information about suspects who might fit the criteria. The response led to the identification of 3 primary suspects, men whose backgrounds and circumstances aligned closely with the profile's specifications. The first suspect was Gerald Maddox, a 68-year-old former construction contractor from Indiana who had owned property near several of the disappearance locations during the relevant time periods. Maddox had a history of domestic violence and had been arrested twice for stalking ex-girlfriends, though charges had been dropped both times due to lack of evidence. The second suspect was Robert Kellner, a 71-year-old retired electrician from Pennsylvania who had worked on commercial construction projects throughout the Midwest during the 1980s and 1990s. Kellner had no criminal record, but interviews with former associates revealed a pattern of inappropriate behavior toward female co-workers and an obsession with control and dominance. The third suspect was William Hatcher, a 65-year-old former maintenance supervisor who had worked for various retail chains, including a brief stint at a Walmart in Michigan during 1996. Hatcher had been fired from multiple jobs for violating company policies regarding employee conduct, and background checks revealed a series of restraining orders filed by women who claimed he had stalked and harassed them. All 3 men became subjects of intensive investigation, with federal agents conducting surveillance and gathering evidence that might connect them to the missing couples. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, financial records that had been digitized as part of a routine government archiving project. William Hatcher had made cash deposits to his bank account totaling $47,000 between November 1997 and February 1998, all money that couldn't be explained by his employment income during that period. More significantly, cell phone records showed that Hatcher had been in the Millfield area on November 27, 1997, the day the Walshes disappeared. Armed with enough evidence for a search warrant, federal agents raided Hatcher's current residence in rural Kentucky on January 15, 2025. What they found exceeded their worst expectations and provided answers to questions that had haunted investigators for decades. The basement of Hatcher's isolated farmhouse had been extensively modified, with concrete block walls identical to those visible in the Walsh photographs, hidden behind a false wall. The agents discovered a collection of over 200 photographs documenting what appeared to be multiple kidnapping and captivity scenarios spanning 40 years. The photographs showed dozens of different victims, couples and individuals who matched the profiles of missing persons from across the Midwest. The images were organized chronologically in labeled albums, each marked with dates and locations that corresponded to known disappearances. The Walsh photographs were there, along with images that solved cold cases dating back to the 1980s. But perhaps the most horrifying discovery was Hatcher's detailed journals, which documented not just the crimes themselves, but his psychological motivations and long-term planning. The entries revealed a man who viewed his victims as specimens in an elaborate psychological experiment, and someone who derived satisfaction from studying human behavior under extreme duress. The journal entries related to the Walsh case were particularly disturbing. November 27, 1997. Selected subjects R&T Walsh from Walmart location. Subjects fit preferred demographic profile: married, childless, emotionally dependent on each other. The initial approach successful, using lost item scenario. Subjects compliant during transport to facility. November 28, 1997. Documentation phase commenced. Subjects showing expected psychological progression from confusion to fear. T subject attempting to protect R subject, behavior consistent with previous observations of bonded pairs. November 30, 1997. And final documentation completed. Subjects maintained dignity longer than anticipated. Disposal scheduled for December 1st. Camera returned to Walmart lost and found as planned for future discovery. The journals revealed that Hatcher had been operating for over 40 years, taking couples from public places and holding them in various facilities he had constructed or modified. The photographs served as both trophies and psychological weapons, designed to document his victims' suffering while ensuring that families would eventually learn of their loved ones' fate. The disposal method mentioned in the journals led agents to a property Hatcher had owned in West Virginia during the 1990s. Ground-penetrating radar revealed multiple burial sites, and excavation began immediately. Over the course of 3 weeks, the remains of 26 individuals were recovered, including those of Rebecca and Thomas Walsh. The forensic evidence confirmed what the photographs had suggested. The victims had been held for extended periods before being killed. The cause of death in most cases appeared to be dehydration or starvation, suggesting that Hatcher had simply stopped providing food and water when he tired of his psychological experiments. William Hatcher was arrested on January 15, 2025, and charged with 26 counts of first-degree murder, numerous kidnapping charges, and federal charges related to interstate transportation of victims. He showed no remorse during questioning, instead expressing satisfaction that his work had finally been recognized. "You have no idea how much effort went into documenting everything properly," he told Agent Hayes during his initial interrogation. "Those families should be grateful that their loved ones contributed to something larger than their small lives could have achieved otherwise." The revelation that the Walsh case was part of a decades-long serial killing spree sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and the families of victims across multiple states. Dorothy Mills, now 80 years old and struggling with advancing dementia, was told that her daughter's remains had been found. Her son Michael later said that, despite her cognitive decline, She seemed to understand and find some measure of peace in finally knowing what had happened to Rebecca. She keeps asking if Rebecca is coming home for dinner, Michael told reporters. I tell her that Rebecca is finally at rest, and Mom nods like she understands. But maybe that's enough. The investigation revealed that Hatcher had been able to operate undetected for so long because of his mobility, but his careful selection of victims who wouldn't be immediately missed, and the failure of different law enforcement agencies to share information effectively. The crimes had been spread across multiple jurisdictions and decades, making pattern recognition nearly impossible without modern database technology. Agent Hayes estimated that if the Walmart camera hadn't been discovered when it was, Hatcher might have continued operating indefinitely. At 65, he was still physically capable of carrying out kidnappings, and his journals indicated that he had been planning additional crimes. The trial of William Hatcher began in federal court on September 15, 2025. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence including the photographs, journals, physical evidence from the burial sites, and testimony from forensic experts who had analyzed the crime scenes. The defense attempted to argue mental incompetence, but psychiatric evaluation revealed a man who was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. On November 27, 2025, exactly 28 years after Rebecca and Thomas Walsh had disappeared, William Hatcher was found guilty on all charges. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning their verdict. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, avoiding the death penalty only because several victim families had requested that he be kept alive to provide information about additional victims who might never have been identified otherwise. During the sentencing phase, victim impact statements were read by family members from across the country. Dorothy Mills, despite her deteriorating condition, insisted on attending the hearing. The statement was read by her son Michael. Rebecca was the light of our lives. She wanted nothing more than to teach children and love her husband. She didn't deserve what happened to her, and neither did Thomas or any of the other victims. We can't bring them back, but we can make sure that this monster never hurts anyone else again. The Hatcher case prompted significant changes in how law enforcement agencies share information about missing persons cases. The National Missing Persons Database was expanded and improved, with new protocols for identifying potential patterns across jurisdictions. The case also led to increased federal funding for cold case investigations and improvements in evidence preservation techniques. For the residents of Millfield, Ohio, the resolution of the Walsh case brought a mixture of relief and horror. The couple they had mourned for nearly 3 decades had finally been found, but the circumstances of their discovery revealed a level of evil that few could have imagined existing in their quiet community. The Walmart where Rebecca and Thomas had last been seen alive installed a memorial plaque in their honor, with a small bronze marker in the customer service area, acknowledging their memory and expressing the community's commitment to never forgetting the victims of violence. The store also implemented new security protocols and staff training programs designed to help employees recognize suspicious behavior and potential predatory situations. The Walsh house on Elm Street, which had remained a rental property for over 20 years, was finally sold to a young family who planned to renovate it completely. Dorothy Mills used the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund at Millfield Elementary School in Rebecca's memory, ensuring that her daughter's love of teaching would continue to impact children's lives for generations to come. As for William Hatcher, he remained in federal prison, showing no remorse for his crimes and continuing to view himself as a misunderstood researcher rather than a serial killer. Prison psychologists reported that he spent his time writing detailed memoirs of his crimes, apparently hoping to find an audience for his twisted theories about human behavior under extreme stress. The final entry in his journal, written shortly before his arrest, provided a chilling glimpse into the mind of a man who had spent 40 years destroying lives. The documentation project nears completion, but 40 years of research have provided invaluable insights into human psychological resilience and the breakdown of social bonds under extreme duress. Future researchers will find my work invaluable in understanding the true nature of human behavior when stripped of social pretenses and reduced to basic survival instincts. The Walsh case officially closed on December 15, 2025, that with the filing of the final forensic reports and the completion of victim identification for all recovered remains. But for the families involved, the healing process would continue for years to come. Agent Hayes, reflecting on the case that had consumed her life for nearly a year, noted that the most disturbing aspect wasn't the crimes themselves, but the calculated nature of the perpetrator's actions. Hatcher hadn't acted out of passion or mental illness, but out of a cold, methodical desire to document human suffering for his own intellectual satisfaction. We have seen serial killers who kill for sexual gratification, for power, for revenge, she told a gathering of federal law enforcement officials. But Hatcher was different. He killed for data. He treated human beings like laboratory specimens, and he documented their destruction with the same clinical detachment a scientist might use to record the results of a chemistry experiment. The investigation also revealed the extent to which modern technology had made the solution possible. Without digital enhancement of the photographs, database analysis to identify pattern connections, and improved forensic techniques for analyzing decades-old evidence, Hatcher might never have been caught. The case became a textbook study in cold case investigation, demonstrating how patience, technology, and interagency cooperation could solve even the most complex and long-standing mysteries. Police academies across the country added the Walsh case to their curricula as an example of how seemingly isolated incidents could be connected to reveal much larger criminal enterprises. But for Dorothy Mills, the resolution brought a peace she hadn't known for nearly 3 decades. Though her advancing dementia meant she couldn't always remember the details of what had happened, she seemed to understand that the long wait was over. She died peacefully in her sleep on March 15, 2026, 4 months after Hatcher's conviction, finally able to rest knowing that her daughter's killer had been brought to justice. The Walsh case serves as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary appearances, that predators can operate for decades without detection, and that sometimes the most innocent decisions, like stopping at Walmart on Thanksgiving Day, can lead to unimaginable tragedy. But it also demonstrates the power of persistence, the importance of never giving up on the search for truth, and the way that modern technology can finally provide answers to questions that have haunted families and communities for generations. 28 years after Rebecca and Thomas Walsh walked into a Walmart store for the last time, their story finally had an ending. It wasn't the ending their families had hoped for, but it was an ending nonetheless. After decades of uncertainty, they could finally rest in peace, knowing that the man who had stolen their lives and documented their suffering would spend the remainder of his days behind bars, where he could never hurt anyone else again. The last photograph in William Hatcher's collection showed not his victims, but empty concrete walls in his basement detention facility. Written on the back in his careful handwriting were the words, "Documentation complete, legacy preserved." He was wrong about the legacy. The only legacy William Hatcher left behind was a trail of devastated families and a case study in human evil that would serve as a warning for future generations. The real legacy belonged to Rebecca and Thomas Walsh and the other victims whose memories would live on in the hearts of those who loved them, and in the improved investigative techniques that would help prevent similar tragedies in the future. The Walmart Vanishing case was finally closed, but its impact on law enforcement, victim advocacy, and community safety would continue for decades to come. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that ensure such horrors can never happen again.